The second the words left Jasmine Crockett's mouth, Rachel Maddow couldn't hold it in. She screamed. It wasn't the polished, professorial tone millions associate with her nightly monologues. It was raw, electric, a rupture that cracked through the studio like a lightning strike. For one suspended moment, the cameras kept rolling, the lights glared, and the control room froze. The anchors at the table tilted their heads in disbelief, unsure if they had just witnessed brilliance unravel or history being written. Gasps echoed from the audience seats just beyond the stage. You could feel them ripple, one after another, like dominoes falling in the dark. Some laughed nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably, clutching phones, already typing furiously. Before producers even had time to cut to commercial, the first tweets began circling the globe. Screens lit up, hashtags formed midair. TikTok creators clipped the moment in real time as if instinct itself knew. This was going viral. Maddow's scream wasn't just noise. It was embodiment. It was the establishment voice breaking at its seams. Years of authority distilled into a single crack of sound. Her hands cut through the air, her jaw set tight, and the words she tried to form wavered beneath the sheer weight of outrage. For her supporters, it looked like passion. For detractors, it looked like collapse. And right beside her, in surgical contrast, sat Jasmine Crockett, her face calm, her posture unflinching. Crockett didn't flinch because she didn't have to. Her words had carried a weight sharpened by truth, and in the silence that followed Maddow's eruption, it was those words, not the scream, that echoed in the minds of millions watching. Maddow's breakdown was dramatic. Crockett's composure was seismic. It was the kind of moment that blurred lines between debate and theater, leaving audiences unsure whether they were witnessing politics or prophecy. Online, reactions hit like a tidal wave. Did Rachel Maddow just lose it on live TV? Wrote one. Crockett's clapback just made history, exclaimed another. The clash was no longer confined to a studio. It was spilling out into living rooms, classrooms, boardrooms. People were texting friends. Turn it on now. You're not going to believe this. And yet, what no one knew at that exact instant was this. Maddow's scream, as surreal as it was, wasn't the story. The story was the line Crockett had delivered before it, a single sentence that would ignite a cultural wildfire. But what Crockett said would make the entire internet stop in its tracks. To understand why this clash struck the nation like a thunderclap, you have to step back and look at the moment we were in. The country was already split down the middle, nerves frayed thin from months of rehashed arguments, nightly showdowns, and a steady drumbeat of headlines demanding everyone choose a side. It wasn't merely about politics anymore. It was about identity, values, even the definition of truth itself. The air in America's living rooms was thick with exhaustion, but also hunger for someone, anyone, to stand up and say what so many felt had been buried under noise. And that's where this debate was supposed to be routine. Just another televised back and forth, another panel of strong personalities checking boxes for their audiences. But from the first moments, it was obvious that this one was different. The atmosphere on set hummed with tension. Maddow leaned forward in her chair, attacking with surgical certainty. Crockett, the fresher face, sat upright, steady, letting her opponent's monologues crash over her without flinching. People at home could feel it. Something was brewing. It wasn't only about two women sparring in front of cameras. It was about what each represented. Maddow, in this story, was the unshakable institution. Years of dominance in intellectual spaces. A voice that had commanded respect across the political landscape. But with that longevity came suspicion, too. Was she speaking for the people or above them? Crockett, by contrast, embodied the underdog spirit. Younger, unpolished in the best way, direct and grounded in lived experience. To many immigrants, working families or identity-proud communities watching around the country, she seemed like one of their own who had made it to the big table. Every clash in this debate carried more weight than words. When Maddow raised her voice, it felt like the voice of establishment America drawing a line in the sand. When Crockett answered, it was like countless unheard voices echoing back through her. The stakes were not just about who would dominate, airtime. They were about whose version of America gets remembered. As Maddow pressed harder, viewers at home leaned forward in their couches. Crockett's silence, those brief pauses while her counterpart thundered on, felt like sand slipping through an hourglass. Time was running out. The debate was closer to slipping entirely Maddow's way, and the cost of that loss was more than a single night of programming. It would be perception. It would be narrative. It would be history's shorthand. Once again, the establishment voice prevailed. Everyone watching had the same thought. If someone doesn't push back now, the narrative is lost, and narratives matter. They ripple outward, through classrooms, social feeds, family dinner tables. They shape how young immigrants explain themselves to classmates who question where they belong. They define whether ordinary working people feel empowered to speak out or silenced because someone in power already raised their voice higher. The temperature climbed in that studio. Maddow's words struck like a hammer, forceful, uncompromising, insistent that her framing was the only framing. The tension wasn't only visible in her body language, it radiated through the camera lens into homes across the nation. The audience, watching live, both in the seats in front of her and broadcast everywhere else, could almost hear the clock ticking. How much longer until this tilted from a heated exchange into an outright rout? And then came Crockett's moment. The calm broke. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw set, but her voice didn't rise. Instead, it cut low, deliberate and devastating. After wave upon wave of pressure, she finally hit back, not with noise, with precision. What happened next changed the conversation not just in that studio, but everywhere. To craft the drama of this viral showdown, you first have to understand the figure at its center, Rachel Maddow. For years, she has been a towering presence in American media, a name that even her critics can't ignore. She isn't just a commentator, she's an institution, a force of nature wrapped in sharp wit, encyclopedic recall, and the unmistakable cadence of an Ivy-educated storyteller who knows how to own a room. Maddow is not merely influential, she is commanding, a lightning rod who can steer the mood of a night's political discourse with a single emphatic phrase. Her genius is unquestionable, yet brilliance, left unchecked, often digs its own grave. Maddow's brilliance has always come with a shadow, the tendency to let passion edge into fury, to let certainty wobble into arrogance. Audiences have adored the fire in her commentary, but they've also seen her lose composure, sometimes going so far in her zeal for the mic drop moment that she undercuts herself. And each time, critics pounce, not because her facts were weak, but because her temper revealed a crack in the veneer of authority she's so carefully built. There have been past moments where this paradox was laid bare. Viewers remember the monologue where Maddow attempted to hold back tears while presenting exclusive documents, her emotions surging beyond the story she was telling. Others recall a heated panel where her interruptions turned so frequent that guests stopped speaking, leaving her voice echoing unchallenged but oddly isolated. Each time, supporters framed it as passion. Detractors called it self-indulgence, but both sides understood the same truth. Maddow cannot always contain the ferocity that propels her. In the mythology of this clash, those contradictions matter, because when Maddow thundered in that studio, the audience wasn't just hearing her reaction to Crockett's line. They were hearing echoes of years of commentary delivered from a perch of confidence so high it often seemed untouchable. She had been the one to deconstruct politicians, to slice through congressional obfuscations with scalpel precision. But now, in this narrative, she steps into the role of the antagonist, not because of what she knows, but because of how she wields it. Arrogance is not about being wrong. It's about refusing to imagine you could be wrong. And in that moment, Maddow's scream became more than a sound. It became a symbol of what happens when accumulated authority begins to fray. The villain in this cinematic tale is not a caricature twirling a mustache, but the towering figure of the establishment voice. Sharp, unrelenting, and ultimately brittle under the weight of its own self-assurance. Over the years, Maddow's rise was meteoric, and rightly so. She commanded audiences with rare skill, dissecting policy like a surgeon, wrapping history and humor into explanations that made viewers feel both informed and inspired. But that rise also insulated her. The louder her voice became across the airwaves, the more it drowned out the need to listen. Authority calcified into habit, and habit into something closer to entitlement. It is this sharp edge, the refusal to cede ground, the conviction to dominate, that set her up as the perfect foil for someone like Crockett. The spectacle of Maddow losing control, even briefly, wasn't shocking because it was unprecedented. It was shocking because it had always been the possibility lingering under her power. Each prior flare, each interruption, each scolding tone was a rehearsal for this bigger unraveling. And when it came not in the controlled environment of a monologue, but standing face to face with someone younger, calmer, and hungrier. The villainy in this framing is not evil intent. It is hubris. It is the belief that dominance holds indefinitely, that authority need never bow to authenticity. Maddow's scream crystallized that hubris into a single, unforgettable instant. And while villains captivate us, audiences crave their fall. Not because they hate them, but because the fall feels like balance restored. And so, in our unfolding drama, Maddow is painted as a Goliath, towering, undeniable, wielding a reputation, like armor and a platform, like a weapon. Opposite her, a rising figure waits, a David, calm not because she lacks fire, but because she knows fire wielded recklessly consumes its master first. The louder Maddow became, the less she represented righteous passion and the more she came to embody overreach, the very establishment assertiveness viewers on the margins longed to see answered. In the conflict that erupted on screen that night, the villain wasn't born in the scream. The scream only confirmed what had been building for years, that even titans stumble, that even polished armor can crack when faced with something unexpected, but every Goliath meets a David. The scream was just the beginning. To grasp why Jasmine, Crockett's calm would shine so brilliantly against Rachel Maddow's eruption, you have to trace the path that brought her there. Crockett's journey is not the gilded ladder of elite connections or easy recognition. It is, instead, a story woven from grit and grit alone. Sleepless nights, relentless work, and battles fought not for headlines, but for ordinary people, who rarely make the news. Born and raised in a community that often felt left behind, Crockett's early reality was not one of waiting podiums or cable studios. It was of closed factory doors, neighbors scraping for rent, and classrooms where resources were stretched thinner than hope. She watched family members and neighbors pressed down by injustice that seemed systemic, inevitable, and merciless, and from an early age she carried the quiet weight of that reality. It didn't harden her. It forged her. Out of those circumstances, her resolve formed not as a hobby, but as survival. When she entered public life, Crockett did it from the ground up. Unlike the polished rollouts of establishment figures, her beginnings were small, grassroots, and personal. She attended community meetings where microphones barely worked, fought cases in overstuffed courtrooms, and earned her reputation one sharp exchange at a time with those who underestimated her. She had no glossy PR machine. She had her voice, and it was enough. That quick wit became her signature early on. Colleagues and opponents alike learned quickly. Interrupt her, and you earned a clapback so deft it would leave even seasoned professionals speechless. Crockett didn't weaponize sarcasm. She sharpened it into a tool of truth. Her words had rhythm, cutting arrogance down to size, exposing contradictions without raising her tone. She became known not just for being articulate, but for defending communities who could not afford the megaphone she carried. Behind the stage presence was struggle. There were years where the financial strain of pursuing justice threatened to break her, campaigns that required exhausting nights of dialing strangers for donations, legal fights where resources ran thin, personal moments when she wondered if the sacrifices, lost sleep, lost security, lost time, would ever pay off. But through every setback, she met adversity with the same pattern: assess, adjust, answer. Crockett never allowed defeat to define her. She simply added it to the arsenal of lessons that would later armor her against anything, even a televised scream. What set her apart was not merely intellect, but authenticity. Viewers could sense it when she spoke. Unlike practiced sound bites, honed in consulting rooms, her words carried the rhythm of lived experience. When Crockett spoke about inequality, people believed her, because she wasn't reciting, she was remembering. This authenticity was her shield and her sword. It's why social media users copied her lines into captions, why young people reposted clips of her speeches as if they were anthems. She embodied the voice of us archetype, not because she claimed it, but because she lived it. Those who scoffed at her underestimated the power of presence. They assumed composure meant weakness. They assumed restraint meant inexperience. They assumed silence under pressure meant she hadn't yet found her footing. But Crockett had been tested long before stepping into any TV studio. The glares across legal benches, the dismissals from those who wrote her off because of her background, her age, or even her accent, had trained her to stand steady under fire. She learned that you don't fight every battle with volume. Sometimes, the deepest cuts come from timing, from patience, from delivering the precise line at the exact moment when your opponent least expects it. Crockett's resilience wasn't just personal. It was inherited from the communities that raised her. She became, in every sense, a vessel of collective endurance. Her sharp comebacks were not just clever, they were rooted in the tradition of marginalized communities who had long learned to wield humor as survival, intellect as defiance, dignity as resistance. She absorbed those lessons in countless living rooms and church halls, each story she heard layering armor on her spirit. By the time she sat across from Maddow, Crockett was no stranger to intellectual combat. But here was the stage brighter than any before, the stakes higher, the opponent towering in cultural weight. And yet, she didn't tremble. She didn't fidget. She collected every ounce of her journey, every insult shrugged off in courtrooms, every late night spent preparing alone, every patronizing smirk she had endured from figures convinced of their own superiority, and she fused all of it into calm. Because calm, for Crockett, was not passivity. It was power. It was the posture of someone who had walked through worse storms than the hot lights of a studio could ever summon. And in those seconds, while Maddow's voice cracked and rose toward its scream, Crockett sat composed. Not because she didn't feel the fire, but because she had mastered it. Her composure was not built in studios. It was built in the small, unseen fights she had survived long before the cameras noticed. And that's why, in the viral moment that unfolded, she didn't simply deliver a clever rejoinder. She delivered history. All those years of fighting uphill battles led to one defining moment in front of a live camera, a moment where fate demanded she decide whether to stand silent while the narrative slipped away, or drop a line so precise, so undeniable that even Maddow's scream couldn't drown it out. The moment Maddow recovered from her scream, the studio felt like it had shifted onto a fault line. Her voice, now strained, climbed higher, sharper, filled with an urgency that made chairs squeak as guests leaned back instinctively. Her words spilled fast, not the neatly stacked arguments she was known for, but overlapping bursts of indignation. She pointed across the table, her hand slicing the air in quick, jagged motions. Every flick of her wrist, every narrowing of her eyes, screamed not just rebuttal, but domination. cameras caught it all. Maddow's chin thrust forward, her jaw tight, her shoulders bending toward Crockett like a boxer stepping in close before the punch. The tone, clean at first, started cracking beneath the weight of emotion, a cascade of volume meant to drown everything else. The strategy was clear. Overwhelm Crockett with speed and force, choke the space with so much noise that no counter would slip through. And yet, Crockett never flinched. Her body language remained neutral, composed, like a stone in the path of a rushing stream. Where Maddow shifted and gestured, Crockett stayed still. Her hands lay folded in her lap, her face quiet, her eyes locked with a focus so unwavering that it only magnified Maddow's frenzy. Viewers across the country could feel it. There was something devastating in that calm. The dialogue intensified. Maddow thundered, accusations, dismissals, interruptions layered one on top of another, each growing louder. She leaned into fragments of statistics, flung pointed jabs disguised as questions, her tone steeped in the certainty of someone accustomed to controlling the floor. She surged forward so quickly she cut off Crockett more than once, and each time, Crockett gave space. She let the interruptions land, allowed the room to hear every ounce of their aggression, and in that allowance, tension built. Like a bowstring being drawn tight, each pause Crockett gave seemed to stretch suspense to its breaking point. The silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. It forced the audience to sit with Maddow's escalating tone in isolation, to weigh it without distraction. Where Maddow wanted momentum, Crockett fed patience. Eyes darted across the set. Other panelists glanced awkwardly at each other, lips pressed thin as they tried to decide whether to interject. The live audience bristled, some whispering prayers for someone to cut her off, others looking down at their phones as alerts buzzed. Online, hashtags multiplied as clips were already spinning outward. Maddow meltdown and Crockett calm were beginning to surface like dueling headlines written in real time. The studio lights pressed heavier, making Maddow's flush cheeks shine, while Crockett's stillness gave her a kind of cinematic glow, the eye of a storm, calm center surrounded by fury. The more Maddow spoke, the more she seemed to expose, not Crockett's weakness, but her own unraveling control. Crockett waited. Seconds dragged. She leaned ever so slightly toward her microphone, but didn't rush. For a brief suspension, Maddow gestured and exclaimed, then realized she was speaking into silence, that the energy she was pouring onto Crockett wasn't being mirrored back. It only deepened the imbalance. And then the break came. Maddow's voice hit a peak, her words tumbling over each other in a cascade meant to bury Crockett entirely. The audience, the cameras, the world perched on the edge of expectation. Surely, Crockett had to answer now. She did, but not with rage. Her voice was low, firm, precise, cutting through the din like glass breaking against concrete. The first word alone froze Maddow mid-motion, her finger suspended halfway in the air. Each phrase was delivered with the composure of someone who had waited deliberately, strategically. Crockett didn't just speak, she detonated, and what fell from her lips in that instant was not only the answer Maddow had been trying to suppress, but a line so sharp it would ricochet through households, phones, and headlines alike. It was the moment the storm shifted, the clash where silence gave way to the strike. And then, Crockett released the line that detonated across the country. It began with silence, the sort of silence that demands attention, that makes even the restless lean still. After reeling from a torrent of Maddow's fury, Crockett finally adjusted her mic with a casual grace that felt almost audacious. Her first word slipped out measured, controlled, the verbal equivalent of a scalpel slicing. Open tension that had swollen the room to a breaking point. Here's what you're missing. The cadence was deliberate. No raised voice, no rush to match Maddow's pitch, only the calm introduction of a rebuttal that promised to dismantle the storm brick by brick. And in that instant, the audience's scattered murmurs went quiet. Maddow froze, her finger midair, as if someone had pressed the pause button on her performance. The entire room, like a taut rope, threatened to snap. Crockett's first line wasn't witty for the sake of wit. It dripped with the weight of truth, shaped by years of hearing excuses, dismissals, and distorted narratives. She spoke plainly, but the plainness cut deeper than any shout. "You can scream at me all night," she added with surgical poise, "but it won't erase the reality that people like me live every day, and it won't erase the truth I just spoke." Those words landed heavy. Maddow's eyes narrowed, but she did not interrupt, not immediately. Her face bore the half-surprised, half-defensive expression of someone suddenly unsure whether dominance had slipped through her clenched fists. The audience gasped audibly, a mix of shock and awe coloring their exhalations. Crockett had not only spoken back, she had reframed the entire debate. For a moment, it seemed the walls themselves leaned closer. The cameras zoomed ever so slightly, catching Crockett's unflinching gaze, her steady voice, her presence more towering and quiet than Maddow's had ever been in fire. A viewer at home might have spilled popcorn, grabbed their phone, or screamed across the room, "Did you hear that?" Crockett didn't stop there. She layered it, methodical as a skilled craftsman fitting stone atop stone. "The reason what I said rattled you," she pressed on, "is because it wasn't aimed at winning airtime. It was aimed at telling a truth you can't drown out, a truth that belongs to every struggling family, every single parent, every immigrant who has had to grow steel in their bones just to be heard." The choice of words was intentional. Crockett wasn't just defending herself, she was speaking, as a vessel for countless communities who had been waiting for their turn at the microphone. With every phrase, she pulled the audience away from Maddow's energy and into hers, backwards through their own lived experiences where the arrogance of institutions had silenced them, too. Maddow tried to interject again, but her timing felt clumsy against Crockett's precision. When she leaned into the mic to correct, Crockett simply paused and turned her head slightly, letting Maddow's interruption echo awkwardly. Then, without tension, she continued. The restraint wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Professionals call it command presence, but here it was more than technique. It was Crockett embodying calm authority that made Maddow look suddenly small, suddenly desperate. As she built momentum, Crockett's phrasing shifted from defensive to instructive, as though she were no longer debating Maddow but teaching a nation. "If you think my words were about you, then you've missed the point. They were about the millions left behind while headlines chase sound bites. They were about dignity. They were about us, not me." The resonance was electric. Viewers, on couches across the country, leaned toward the screen. Phones buzzed relentlessly as live clips circulated online, stitches and duets already climbing numbers on TikTok before Crockett even finished speaking. In living rooms, whole families debated aloud. "She's right," someone whispered, their voice carrying the certainty of recognition. "And Maddow?" She faltered. Her lips moved as if to summon a retort, but her timing had been stripped from her. Crockett's words carved a clarity too sharp, too present. To raise her voice now would have seemed petulant, reactionary. For the first time that night, Maddow's authority didn't feel commanding. It felt cornered. Crockett pressed the advantage, with the grace of a practiced fighter. She didn't gloat. She didn't grin. She leaned in slightly, the slightest softening of her tone, and delivered the clincher, every syllable vibrating with consequence. "Because here's the difference between us. Screaming is an attempt to be heard. But I don't need to scream. The truth carries on its own." The studio gasped in unison. A few claps broke through from the audience before being smothered by the tension of live broadcast. But the moment was unrecoverable. Maddow's scream had just been inverted. The narrative flipped inside out. What Maddow had thought was her weapon had been reframed as vulnerability. Crockett stood radiant in calm, wrapped in authenticity. sharpening her own identity against her opponent's unraveling fury. Millions at home felt the release like a collective exhale. Social feeds lit up instantly. Crockett ended her with one line. "That's how you handle arrogance, with composure." Replay that last sentence again, and again. The counterattack wasn't just a defense, it was a cultural moment, a living meme, the kind of exchange that transcends politics to become folklore in internet history. For decades, people had seen fiery voices dominate debates, had watched conversations turn into shouting matches. But what Crockett demonstrated in that searing minute was something rare: the triumph of restraint, the elegance of refusing to fight fire with fire, and instead exposing arrogance with poise. What viewers witnessed wasn't a battle of equals. It was a shift, the establishment silenced not by louder thunder, but by an unshakable stillness. Crockett leaned back, her piece delivered, as silence consumed the space once again. Maddow shuffled in her chair, signaling for her turn, but the damage had been done. The contrast was irreversible. No scream, no interruption, no towering reputation could compete with the calm hero's masterstroke. The reverberations of those words spread instantly, beyond the studio, beyond the night's broadcast. On timelines, hashtags trended mercilessly. In group chats, friends replayed the clip, rewinding just to feel the cadence of Crockett's last line hit again and again. On breakfast tables by morning, people quoted her words like scripture, like inspiration, like a motto to hold in the face of their own everyday arrogance. It wasn't merely a takedown, it was a reminder that truth, when delivered with steel and grace, can pierce through arrogance like lightning and leave behind the unmistakable smell of something scorched. And as the applause finally began to simmer under the strain of professionalism in the studio, there was no mistaking it. Maddow's unraveling had found its counterpoint. The tide had shifted. The story, once her arena, was now Crockett's stage. But the studio could not contain what was about to come next. The real eruption would not be measured in seconds of airtime, but in the millions of reactions that cascaded across the digital world the moment Crockett's words hit the screen. The scream had been shocking. The counterattack was defining, and the shockwaves were only beginning. The moment Jasmine Crockett's words sliced through Maddow's scream, the studio sat suspended in stunned silence. But outside those walls, the reaction was anything but quiet. Social media didn't simply light up, it detonated. Within seconds of Crockett's mic drop, hashtags sprouted across Twitter like wildfire leaping from branch to branch. Crockett, Clapback, Ace Maddow, Meltdown, ing Truth without screams. Rival hashtags competed for dominance, yet one thing became clear almost immediately. Crockett's line had transcended the debate, becoming a cultural moment in itself. Clips of the exchange were uploaded before the broadcast even cut to commercial. In living rooms, teens clipped screen recordings on their phones and sent them to group chats with captions like, "This is how you shut someone down without losing your chill." TikTok edits hit the feed within minutes, pulsating with dramatic sound effects, slow-motion zoom-ins on Maddow's frozen expression, even entire montages set to cinematic beats. You couldn't scroll 3 posts without bumping into Crockett's voice echoing from someone's device, framed with captions like "Icon Energy" and "Mentally, I'm this calm forever." Celebrities joined in. A well-known singer retweeted Crockett's line with a string of flame emojis. An actor-turned-activist reposted the clip with the caption, "The scream is already forgotten. This will be remembered." Even sports figures chimed in, comparing Crockett's clapback to a buzzer-beating shot, the kind that rewrites a scoreboard with seconds left. Meanwhile, memes spread with terrifying speed. One image showed Maddow mid-scream, overlaid with the words, "When you realize the Wi-Fi is down." Another meme placed Crockett calmly at the table with the caption, The whole group chat when one person finally says what everybody's thinking. Comment sections became feast halls of digital applause. She didn't raise a finger, and yet she shut it down, read one viral comment. Another scrolled across feeds with thousands of likes. Generations of women silenced at dinner tables were vindicated in one sentence tonight. And then the ripple spread to other networks. Rival commentators scrambled to rewrite their evening segments as the clip broke their original run sheets. By midnight, national morning shows were contacting producers, scrambling for permission to air it once more. Panels were convened overnight. Pundits asked to opine on what it meant, as if truth itself needed dissection. On one network, the reaction was begrudging admiration for Crockett's composure. On another, talking heads tried to minimize it, insisting Maddow had merely been caught up in passion. But denial didn't matter. The clip was bigger than editorial. Spin. In online spaces, validation poured in from every corner. Immigrant families posted tearful accounts about replaying Crockett's line at the dinner table, some calling it a moment of reclamation. Students began using the audio clip in videos where they themselves silently sat through authority figures talking over them, only to lip-sync Crockett's decisive last words. The debate had become something more than television. It was a template, a mirror, a call to anyone who had ever felt drowned out by someone with more volume but less truth. Even late-night comedians capitalized on it. One opened their monologue playing Maddow's scream 7 times in succession before abruptly cutting to Crockett's calm face and adding, "And ladies and gentlemen, that's how you end a movie." The crowd erupted in laughter, but it was a laughter laced with recognition. They weren't reacting to just another gaffe. They were reacting to a cultural narrative flipping in real time. The tidal wave of attention left producers in disbelief. At Crockett's office, staffers working late described their phones vibrating so incessantly they had to put devices face down just to focus. By dawn, Crockett's name had been searched more than any trending celebrity, eclipsing even sports, finals, and Hollywood scandals. News feeds plastered her image. Chest lifted, eyes calm, voice composed, juxtaposed against Maddow's captured scream, a digital David versus Goliath portrait already being canonized in pixels. Inside comment sections, the chorus was unanimous. "I've never felt so seen," wrote one. "This wasn't just a clapback. This was therapy," wrote another. Thousands echoed simply, "This is the America I believe in." By morning, memes, applause, and hashtags had elevated Crockett to symbolic status, calm defiance embodied, dignity in action, a reminder that voices don't need to match decibels to win a debate. Platforms reported millions of impressions, and advertisers scrambled to piggyback on the trend. Even satirical accounts leaned in, posting faux product ads promising Crockett's calm TM, the antidote to screams. The aftermath was not chaos. It was acceleration. Crockett had pierced through the screen, stepping into cultural consciousness with force no strategist could have planned. The scream was already fading into caricature, but her words, the words delivered without shouting, continued to boom. Louder in their restraint, exactly the paradox that made them unforgettable. But as the memes swirled, the hashtags climbed, and the online applause reached fever pitch, something else was happening behind closed doors. While millions entertained themselves with jokes and edits, the clip had also reached places where silence did not follow reaction. It reached the corridors of power. Because by the time morning broke, it wasn't celebrities or TikTokers replaying Crockett's line. It was lawmakers, strategists, and staffers watching again and again. And what unfolded in that sphere would prove even more consequential than the online storm. But the biggest shock wasn't online. It came in the halls of power hours later. In the hours and days after the broadcast, when the viral storm had cooled into its steadier rhythm of commentary and reflection, Jasmine Crockett stepped out not with gloating, not with rehearsed victory speeches, but with something far more resonant. She refused to frame Maddow's scream as a personal humiliation inflicted upon her opponent. Instead, she reframed it as a lesson, one about what happens when arrogance collides with calm truth. It wasn't about me versus Rachel, she told an audience that gathered later. It was about whether dignity can still exist in our public conversations, whether calm, grounded truth has the strength to outshine chaos. Her words transformed what could have remained a meme into a parable, and in that parable, people found themselves. Because here's the truth. We have all been Maddow. We have all felt the panic of losing control, the burning frustration that makes us raise our voices louder than we intended, the years of bottled tension that collapse into shouting when words fail us. Maddow's scream was not foreign. It was familiar. It was human. That familiarity explains why so many understood it, even as they mocked it. But what Crockett offered, in her composure, was an alternative vision of how to respond to being pressed, dismissed, or attacked. And that vision was powerful. Her patience reminded people that dignity does not simply survive storms. It can steady them. Her poise showed that resilience is not silent submission. It is deliberate control, the ability to funnel passion into clarity instead of chaos. When Crockett answered with measured truth, she modeled something greater than a perfect soundbite. She modeled what countless communities have practiced for generations, enduring arrogance with grace, wearing down hostility not by matching its fury, but by holding firm until it collapses under the weight of its own bluster. Her reframing invited audiences to look inward. Teachers watched the clip and thought of moments in classrooms where holding composure taught louder lessons than lectures ever could. Workers thought of boardroom encounters where calm rebuttals earned them respect that shouting never could. Parents recalled sitting through insults at dinner tables, choosing restraint over retaliation. Crockett's choice became more than political tactics. It became a personal compass. The crescendo came not just from Crockett's words, but from how viewers could recast their own lives in her stead. The viral line wasn't simply what she said. It was the opportunity she opened for everyone to imagine themselves in her role, the calm one, the poised one, the victor without spite. She gave people a new archetype of power, not the loudest voice in the room, but the steadiest. And so the lesson expanded. Maddow's scream, unforgettable though it was, became a cautionary footnote, the moment when brilliance veered into arrogance and collapsed under its own weight. Crockett's Clapback became the lasting memory, a model of composure that turned noise into revelation. The story almost wrote itself, the establishment unraveling, the underdog rising, truth unshaken in the face of fury. In living rooms, the moral crystallized. "We've all been Maddow," one viral comment declared, losing composure in the face of changing tides. But we can choose to be Crockett, the voice that steadies the storm. That sentence was copied into tweets, captions, and Instagram slideshows. Teachers placed it onto classroom walls. Community organizers ended meetings by repeating it as affirmation. What began as a single viral exchange was now a mantra of resilience, a rallying cry for those who wanted to see civility triumph over the chaos. The story no longer belonged solely to the broadcast. It belonged to anyone who had ever been dismissed, talked over, shouted down, or underestimated. Crockett's composure proved that victory does not require aggression. It requires authenticity, precision, and the strength to endure until the decisive moment arrives. The scream had been noise. The clapback, however, was legacy. And from that viral night forward, Crockett's calm turned into something even more enduring. A symbolic reminder that dignity, true, unflinching dignity, is not fragile at all. It can stand tall under the hottest lights and still rise undefeated when the chaos subsides. Rachel Maddow screamed, yes. The sound of it still lingers in the footage, raw and unforgettable. But when the dust settled, when the hashtags cooled into headlines, it wasn't the scream that history held on to, it was Jasmine Crockett's Clapback. That one calm, razor-sharp line turned the entire balance of power on its head. Maddow's fury filled the air for seconds. Crockett's poise reshaped the narrative for generations. And that is the heartbeat of this story. Moments of outrage may grab attention, but it is truth, justice, and dignity that endure. Fury flares, burns fast, and burns out. But the voice that carries calm conviction, rooted not in noise but in authenticity, leaves a mark. Crockett showed us that composure is not passive. It is power refined, sharpened, and delivered in exactly the right moment. That is why her words outlived the scream. That is why her response now echoes like a lesson, waiting for all of us to learn. Think about it. How many times in our lives are we pushed to shout? How many times do we feel tempted to prove ourselves by sheer volume alone? Maddow's outburst was human. Crockett's restraint was transformational. And between those two choices, we saw the map of what kind of nation we could be. So let this moment be more than a viral clip. Let it be a call to elevate dignity over arrogance, a call to echo truth louder than fury ever could, a call to build a country where calm courage is celebrated, not silenced. Rachel Maddow screamed. But Jasmine Crockett's Clapback is what history will remember. Carry that forward, share it, live it, and never forget, the storm always breaks, but the steady voice stands forever.